I never believed in miracles until that morning by the river. I had spent nearly 3 decades as a wildlife photographer, traveling to every corner of this earth, capturing nature in its rawest forms, from the frozen tundra of Alaska to the burning deserts of Australia. Yet nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I was about to witness on the banks of that African river. I had arrived in this remote region of the savannah 5 days earlier, my Land Rover packed with equipment, dried food, water purification tablets, and the eternal hope that this trip would yield something extraordinary. The rainy season had hit with unexpected fury, transforming the landscape into something almost unrecognizable. What had been a peaceful valley with a gentle stream meandering through golden grass was now a battleground between land and water, where the river had declared war and was winning decisively. My camp was a simple affair, a waterproof tent pitched on higher ground about 50 meters from what used to be the riverbank, but was now just a memory swallowed by the advancing flood. I had come here specifically because of the storms, not in spite of them. There is something magnificent about nature unleashed, something that speaks to the primordial part of the human soul that remembers when we too were at the mercy of wind and rain. I wanted to capture that power, that raw beauty, the moment when the sun finally breaks through and bathes everything in golden light, when the animals emerge from their shelters and the world seems reborn. It was a romantic notion, I suppose, the kind that drives photographers to uncomfortable places for uncertain rewards. But this particular morning, as I crawled out of my tent with my camera already hanging around my neck and my boots sinking into mud that seemed eager to claim them, I felt a strange electricity in the air, a sense that something important was going to happen. The river roared with a voice that had kept me awake for 3 straight nights, a constant thunder that made conversation impossible even with myself. It had swollen to perhaps 4 times its normal width, ripping away trees that had stood for generations, pulling entire sections of the bank into its brown, churning embrace. The water was the color of old coffee, thick with sediment and debris, angry and impatient as it rushed toward some distant ocean. I had set up my observation point on a muddy rise that gave me a clear view of the destruction, and it was there, scanning the chaos through my telephoto lens, that I first saw the rock. It jutted from the center of the river, like a black fist raised in defiance, water exploding around it in white foam, barely large enough to support anything larger than a bird. I almost dismissed it, just another obstacle in the river's path, but something made me adjust my focus, zoom in closer, and that is when my heart stopped. Clinging to that rock, tiny and desperately vulnerable, was a lion cub. I could see its small body trembling, soaked fur plastered against ribs that showed through its skin, little paws scrabbling for purchase on the slick surface. Through my lens, I watched as wave after wave crashed over the rock, submerging the cub completely for seconds at a time, and each time I was certain it would be swept away. But somehow those tiny claws found grip again. The cub could not have been more than 10 or 11 weeks old, still with that baby face and oversized paws that promised the powerful predator it would become if it lived. But survival seemed impossible. I lowered my camera, my hands shaking, and looked at the river with my naked eyes, trying to calculate distances and currents, trying to find some solution that my brain knew did not exist. The rock was at least 30 meters from where I stood, the current between us moving so fast that logs and branches shot past like missiles. Even if I had rope, which I did not, even if I were a strong swimmer, which I was not, the river would have me in seconds. I stood there in my impotence, feeling tears of frustration mixing with the spray from the river. I am not typically an emotional man. My profession requires a certain detachment, an ability to witness suffering without intervening, because nature is nature and we are merely observers. But this was different. This was not a predator taking prey, not the natural cycle of life and death. This was just cruel accident, a baby in the wrong place when the storm hit, separated from its family by forces it could not understand. I found myself praying, really praying, for the first time since I was a child, begging whatever force might be listening to send help, to perform some impossible rescue, knowing even as I prayed that miracles do not happen in the real world. I thought about trying to reach the cub with a branch, and I actually searched for one, pulling a long piece of waterlogged wood from the mud and extending it toward the water while lying on my stomach. But it was hopeless. The branch reached maybe 1/3 of the distance, and then the current simply ripped it from my hands and carried it away as if it were nothing. The cub slipped lower on the rock, one of its back legs losing contact completely, dangling in the air above the churning water, and I heard myself scream, a wordless cry of anguish and rage at my inability to help. I pounded my fists into the mud, feeling it splash up onto my face, and I did not care. What good was all my experience, all my expensive equipment, all my knowledge of the wild if I could not save one small life right in front of me? I was about to turn away, unable to watch the inevitable end, when I heard it, a sound different from the river's roar, the sound of heavy movement through thick vegetation, branches snapping under considerable weight. My first thought was that the mother had come, that a lioness was about to emerge, and I would be in terrible danger, trapped between her and her drowning baby with nowhere to run. I scrambled backward through the mud, ready to sprint for my Land Rover, my heart hammering not from exertion, but from fear of those powerful jaws and sharp claws. But what emerged from the wall of giant ferns and elephant ear leaves was not a lioness. A silverback gorilla stepped out of the green shadows, and I forgot how to breathe. He was massive, easily 400 pounds of pure muscle, with black fur that glistened with moisture from the forest, and that distinctive silver saddle across his broad back that marked him as a mature, dominant male. His face, with its prominent brow ridge and deep, intelligent dark eyes, was set in an expression of intense concentration. He did not look at me, did not even acknowledge my presence as relevant or threatening. His eyes went directly to the river, scanned the chaos, and then locked onto the black rock and the golden shape clinging to it. I saw something in that gaze that took my breath away completely. Understanding, purpose, determination. This gorilla had come for a reason. He had heard or sensed or somehow known that help was needed, and he had come to provide it. Without any hesitation, without the cautious behavior that animals normally show when approaching dangerous situations, the gorilla walked straight toward the water's edge. His knuckles left deep impressions in the mud as he moved, prints that dwarfed my own boot prints nearby, and I found myself crawling backward to give him space, watching with a mixture of awe and terror at what was unfolding. I had read everything available about gorillas during my career, studied their behavior, their social structures, their remarkable intelligence, and I knew that they typically avoided water, that they were not natural swimmers like some other primates. To see this massive silverback walking deliberately toward a flooded river, intent on entering it, contradicted everything I understood about gorilla behavior. The water hit his legs as he took his first step into the river, and he did not flinch, did not pause to reconsider. Another step, and the water reached his knees, the muddy bottom sucking at his feet with each movement, but his weight and strength made each step firm and purposeful. I watched, unable to process what I was seeing, as he waded deeper, the brown water rising up his thick legs, then his torso, the current beginning to push against his body with visible force. When the water reached the gorilla's chest, the riverbed dropped away suddenly. One moment he was walking, solid and grounded, and the next he was floating, and the current immediately claimed him, pushing his massive body sideways, trying to sweep him downstream like it had done to trees and debris. But instead of fighting the current head-on, which would have been futile even for him, the silverback did something that demonstrated intelligence that left me speechless. He angled his body, using the very force of the river to help propel him diagonally across toward the rock. His arms, grotesquely muscular and powerful, moved in wide, sweeping strokes through the water. It was not elegant swimming, not the graceful motion of an otter or seal. It was pure brute strength applied with clear purpose. Each stroke fought against tons of moving water. Each one gained precious inches toward the cub that was fading fast. I had grabbed my camera again, operating now on pure instinct, my hands still trembling so badly that I could barely keep the viewfinder steady. Through my lens, I saw a large tree trunk, torn from its roots somewhere upstream, spinning in the current and heading directly toward the swimming gorilla. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, knowing it was useless, that he could not hear me over the river's roar, but the sound came out anyway, raw and desperate. The trunk hit the gorilla square in the shoulder, with an impact I could hear even over the water, a sickening thud that would have knocked any human unconscious or worse. The silverback's head went under briefly, his whole body spinning from the force of the collision, and I thought that was it, that he would be swept away, that this brave attempt would end in tragedy. But his head broke the surface again. He coughed out water, shook his massive head as if clearing it, and simply continued swimming. Nothing, not the river, not the debris, not exhaustion or pain, was going to stop him from reaching that cub. I realized I was holding my breath, watching the distance close between rescuer and victim, my entire body tense as if I could somehow transfer my energy across the space to help him. 20 meters. 15. The cub had seen the gorilla now, its small head turning between the approaching figure and the water that threatened to claim it at any moment. The little lion was clearly at the end of its strength, slipping lower on the rock, its grip weakening with each passing second. One front paw lost its hold completely and slid into the water, leaving only 3 small paws supporting a waterlogged, exhausted body. 10 meters. The gorilla was fighting harder now, the current strongest here in the middle of the river's channel. His breathing was labored. I could see his chest heaving even from the bank, but his eyes never left the cub, never wavered from his goal. 5 meters. Another massive wave hit, and this time the cub finally lost its battle with the rock. Its small body slid off the slick surface, tiny claws scratching uselessly at stone, and it fell into the churning water. I screamed. The cub was falling, but the gorilla was already there. With one final powerful surge, he closed the remaining distance. One of his huge hands slammed onto the rock, fingers spreading and gripping with desperate strength, while his other hand disappeared beneath the brown water, searching, reaching. I saw the gorilla's face tense with effort, lips pulling back to reveal impressive teeth, every muscle in his neck and shoulders standing out in stark relief against his wet fur. Then that hand emerged from the water, and clutched in it, held with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such massive fingers, was the cub. The silverback pressed the small lion against his chest, creating a pocket of air and safety against his body, using himself as a living breakwater to shield it from the waves. The little cub coughed, expelling water from its lungs, its body shuddering with the effort, but it was alive, clinging now to the gorilla's fur with whatever strength remained in its small paws. The gorilla held it there for a long moment, allowing the cub to recover, protecting it with his body while the river raged around them. Then, with the cub secure against his chest, he began the journey back to shore. This leg would be harder, I knew, because now he had to fight against the current instead of using it, and he had only one arm free to swim with, the other holding firmly to his precious cargo. Every stroke was visible agony. The muscles in his back bulged under the wet fur. His face showed pure strain, but never, not for 1 second, did he loosen his grip on the cub. I was crying openly now, tears streaming down my mud-covered face, witnessing courage of a kind I had never imagined existed. This gorilla owed nothing to this lion. They were not even remotely related species. Their kind did not interact except to avoid each other in the wild, and yet here he was, risking everything, fighting exhaustion and injury, and the river itself to save a baby that was not his own. It was the most profoundly moving thing I had ever seen in 3 decades of watching nature. The silverback reached shallower water, his feet finding the riverbed again, and he walked the final meters, water pouring off his body in cascades, creating temporary streams that ran back toward the main river. When he reached the muddy zone, just 3 meters from where I knelt, paralyzed with emotion, he stopped. Slowly, with extraordinary care, he lowered himself to sit on his haunches, and then, using both hands now, he placed the cub gently on the ground. The small lion coughed more water, its little body shaking violently with the effort, but its eyes were open, its legs were moving, it was alive, traumatized and exhausted, and soaked to the bone, but gloriously, impossibly alive. The gorilla sat there, breathing heavily, watching the cub with those dark, unfathomable eyes, and I realized I was witnessing something that would change how I understood animals forever. This was not instinct, not some automatic response programmed by evolution. This was conscious choice, deliberate compassion, courage that transcended species boundaries. The cub made a sound then, a tiny mewing barely audible over the river, weak but alive. And as if that sound were a signal, the tall grass behind me exploded with movement. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and what I saw made my blood run cold. From the green reeds that towered 2 meters high, emerged the lionesses, 1, 2, 3, 4 adult females, each easily 250 pounds of pure lethal muscle. Their golden eyes were fixed on the cub, their bodies tense with barely contained emotion. I found myself trapped in the worst possible position, directly between a group of desperate mother lions and their baby. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to pause here and ask you something from my heart. This story, this moment that changed my life forever, needs to be heard by more people. Not because it is my story, but because it reminds us that compassion exists in places we never expect, that courage wears many faces, and that the natural world still holds mysteries that can restore our faith in something greater than ourselves. If this moment has touched you, if you feel what I felt on that muddy riverbank, please subscribe to this channel. Not with a casual click, but with intention, because these stories matter. They matter more now than ever when the world feels so divided, when we forget that kindness transcends boundaries we think are permanent. And please, I am asking genuinely, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, what this story means to you, whether you have ever witnessed something that made you believe in miracles. I read every single comment, and your words give me strength to keep sharing these moments with the world. Now let me tell you what happened next, because what I witnessed in the following minutes defied everything I thought I knew about the animal kingdom. My brain was screaming at me to run, every instinct howling that I was seconds away from being torn apart by predators who would see me as a threat near their vulnerable cub. But my body knew the terrible truth that running would only trigger their hunting instincts, so I remained absolutely still, a statue made of mud and terror, waiting for the attack that would end my life in moments. But the lionesses did not look at me. They walked around me as if I were a rock, a tree, something without importance or threat. Their eyes never left the cub. They moved past me with single-minded focus, and I realized with stunning clarity that in this moment I was irrelevant. They had come for their baby and nothing else mattered. Behind them, moving with the absolute confidence of undisputed royalty, came the male. I had seen male lions before in my career, had photographed several during my years of fieldwork, but none compared to this magnificent creature. His mane was spectacular, dark as midnight near his face, lightening to chocolate brown at the edges, thick and full, the sign of an animal in his prime. His body was pure power, muscles rippling under his tawny fur with each measured step, and when he emerged fully from the grass, I understood why he ruled this territory without challenge. The 5 lions formed a semicircle on the muddy bank, the photographer now forgotten on their left, the gorilla still sitting with the cub on their right, and between them, perhaps 4 meters of churned mud, stood a solitary gorilla facing a complete pride of lions. The mathematics were simple and deadly. No gorilla, regardless of strength, could survive against 5 adult lions if they attacked. I braced myself to witness murder, an act of violence that would punish the silverback for his compassion, and my camera hung forgotten around my neck because I could not, would not, document such brutality. But the lions did not attack. They did not growl, did not show teeth, did not flatten their ears in warning or threat. Instead, something completely impossible began to unfold before my disbelieving eyes. The great male, the king of this territory, the apex predator who bowed to nothing and no one, slowly sat back on his haunches. Then he lifted his massive front paws, each one capable of breaking a zebra's neck with a single blow, and pressed them together in front of his broad chest. He lowered his magnificent head, that crown of dark mane falling forward, in a gesture of reverence, of gratitude, of recognition of something greater than territory or instinct, or the rules that normally govern the savage world. One by one, the lionesses did the same. 5 powerful, deadly lions, bowing before a gorilla who had risked everything to save one of their own. I felt something break inside my chest, some barrier between the rational and the miraculous, and I wept without shame, without trying to stop the tears that flowed freely down my face. Time seemed suspended in that moment. The river continued its indifferent roar, uncaring about the miracle unfolding on its bank. But above us, the clouds that had dominated the sky for 4 days were finally breaking. The first rays of sunlight in nearly a week pierced through in dramatic columns of golden light, and one of those beams illuminated the scene like a celestial spotlight, bathing the bowing lions and the seated gorilla in a glow that seemed otherworldly, as if heaven itself was bearing witness to this moment of grace. I lifted my camera with trembling hands, operating on autopilot, my finger pressing the shutter again and again, capturing images I knew would challenge human perceptions about animal consciousness, about the capacity for gratitude and recognition between species. But even as I photographed, part of me understood that no image could truly capture what it felt like to be there, to be a witness to this moment of pure grace. The gorilla remained seated, accepting their reverence with dignified stillness. He showed no triumph, no pride, only a profound tranquility that radiated from his massive form. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the male lion lifted his head. His golden eyes met the dark eyes of the gorilla, and in that exchange of gazes passed something no human could fully translate: understanding, mutual respect, recognition that courage knows no species boundaries. Then the mother moved. One of the lionesses separated from the group, approaching with slow, deliberate steps that clearly communicated she came with no violent intentions. She moved toward the cub, which still lay in the mud where the gorilla had placed it, trembling and weak. She lowered her great head and pressed her nose against the small, wet body, sniffing deeply, checking for injuries, making certain this was truly her baby returned from the jaws of death. A sound came from her then, a sound I had never heard from a lion in all my years in the field, a low guttural moan of pure relief, of pain released, of gratitude impossible to express any other way. She picked up the cub gently by the scruff of its neck, the way mother cats have carried their young since the beginning of time, and lifted it from the mud. The small lion hung limp from her mouth, exhausted but safe, finally home. The other lionesses moved closer, forming a protective circle around mother and cub, touching it with their noses, adding their own sounds of welcome and relief. The male remained apart, as befitted his role, but his eyes followed every movement, ensuring his heir, his future, was truly well. Then, as deliberately as he had arrived, the gorilla stood. Water still dripped from his fur in steady streams, forming a puddle at his feet. He turned toward the wall of vegetation from which he had emerged, his work here completed. The lionesses parted, creating a path for him, their heads still lowered in continued respect. The male took a step aside, an extraordinary concession, allowing the gorilla to pass without challenge through what was indisputably lion territory. The silverback walked toward the jungle with slow, heavy steps, clearly exhausted from his ordeal, every movement speaking of depleted strength and accumulated pain from his battle with the river. At the edge of the tall grass, just before the green shadows would swallow him, he paused. He looked back over his massive shoulder, not toward the lions, but toward me, toward the human who had witnessed everything. Our eyes met for the second time that day, and in his gaze I saw something that would haunt me in the best possible way for the rest of my life. A deep intelligence, a soul that understood exactly what he had done and why it mattered. Then the gorilla disappeared into the vegetation, the leaves and ferns closing behind him like a green curtain, and he was gone. The lions began their own retreat, the mother carrying her cub back to the safety of their territory, the other females flanking her protectively. The male was last to leave, pausing exactly where the gorilla had paused, looking toward that same opening in the vegetation. Some understanding had passed between those two powerful beings, some recognition that transcended the usual rules of the wild. Then he too turned and followed his pride, the rescued cub, hidden safe among them. Alone on the muddy riverbank, I finally lowered my camera with hands that would not stop shaking. My legs could no longer support me, and I collapsed, sitting directly in the mud, not caring how it soaked through my clothes, not caring about anything except the overwhelming weight of what I had just witnessed. My expensive camera hung forgotten around my neck, mud-splattered and probably damaged, but none of that mattered. I had captured images, yes, hundreds of them, but the real story was written in my memory, in my racing heart, in the tears that now flowed freely down my mud-covered face. I sat there for what might have been 10 minutes or an hour. I honestly could not tell, my sense of time completely destroyed by the intensity of what had unfolded. The river continued its relentless flow, brown and swollen and indifferent to the miracle that had just occurred on its banks, but I knew I would carry this truth with me always, that I had been chosen somehow to witness something that would challenge everything humans believed about the animal kingdom, about consciousness, about the capacity for compassion in creatures we considered driven only by instinct and survival. When I finally found the strength to stand, my legs wobbled beneath me like those of a newborn calf, and I had to steady myself against a nearby tree trunk. I looked at the spot where the gorilla had sat with the rescued cub, where the lions had bowed in reverence, and I saw the impressions in the mud, the physical evidence that this had really happened, that I had not hallucinated or dreamed it. The gorilla's massive handprints were still visible, slowly filling with water, and beside them the smaller paw prints of the lions, and there in the center, a tiny depression where the cub had lain. I took more photographs of these marks, documenting everything, knowing that people would doubt this story, that skeptics would claim it was impossible, that I had somehow staged it or misunderstood what I saw. But I knew the truth, and these images, combined with the shots I had captured of the rescue itself, would stand as testimony to what occurred on this muddy bank, on a morning when the world seemed determined to show me that miracles still exist. I walked slowly back to my camp, my boots squelching with each step, leaving a trail of mud and water behind me. My tent looked exactly as I had left it that morning, my breakfast dishes still sitting unwashed by the cold campfire, my spare equipment still carefully packed in its waterproof cases, everything normal and mundane and completely unchanged, while I had been fundamentally transformed. I sat heavily on my camping chair and began the process of checking my camera equipment, more out of habit than genuine concern. The camera had survived despite the mud and moisture, protected by its professional-grade weather sealing, and as I scrolled through the images on the small screen, I felt my breath catch in my throat again. They were there, all of it captured in stark digital clarity. The gorilla entering the water, swimming toward the rock, pulling the cub from the river, carrying it to shore, and then, most incredibly, the lions bowing before him. The lighting from that single shaft of sunlight breaking through the clouds had been perfect, almost too perfect, casting everything in golden tones that made the scene look like a Renaissance painting. These photographs would change my career. I knew that immediately. They would be published in every major magazine, win awards, be studied by scientists and behaviorists trying to understand what they represented. But more than that, they would touch hearts. They would make people question their assumptions about animals, about consciousness, about the boundaries we draw between humans and the natural world. I spent the rest of that day in camp, unable to do anything productive, just sitting and thinking, replaying the events over and over in my mind, trying to process the weight of what I had witnessed. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful after the days of grey storm clouds, I heard sounds from the direction where the lions had disappeared. Roars, but not aggressive ones. These were the contact calls that lions use to communicate location and status to their pride members. I imagined the mother with her cub, now dried and warm and safe, surrounded by her sisters and protected by their powerful male, and I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that story had a happy ending. And somewhere in the forest, in the green shadows where humans rarely ventured, was a silverback gorilla who had done something extraordinary, who had displayed courage and compassion that transcended the supposed divide between thinking and feeling beings. That night, lying in my tent, listening to the river's roar gradually diminish as the floodwaters began to recede, I thought about what compels any being, human or animal, to risk everything for another. The gorilla had gained nothing from his rescue attempt, had risked drowning, had expended enormous energy and put himself in potential danger from grateful but still deadly lions, all to save a creature that was not his species, not his family, not his responsibility. Evolutionary biologists would struggle to explain his behavior, would search for some genetic advantage, some hidden benefit that justified the risk, but I had looked into that gorilla's eyes, had seen the intelligence and purpose there, and I knew that sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. He saved the cub because it was the right thing to do, because he could, because somewhere in that magnificent brain existed a moral framework that recognized suffering and chose to act against it. That realization was perhaps more profound than the rescue itself, because it suggested that the qualities we consider uniquely human, compassion, altruism, moral choice, might not be uniquely human at all. The next morning, I broke camp earlier than planned. I had originally intended to stay another week, hoping to photograph the aftermath of the storms, but I knew now that nothing I could capture in the remaining days would compare to what I already had. More importantly, I felt an overwhelming need to share this story, to get these images out into the world where they could do the most good. As I packed my equipment into the Land Rover, carefully securing the memory cards that held the precious photographs in multiple locations in case of theft or accident, I took one last look at the river. It had already dropped significantly overnight, the water level down by at least a meter, the current slower and less violent. In a few more days, it would return to its normal, peaceful state, and no one looking at it would ever guess at the drama that had unfolded on its banks. I drove out of the valley on muddy tracks that threatened to bog down my vehicle several times, but eventually I reached firmer ground and then paved road, and with each kilometer that passed, the experience began to feel almost dreamlike, so extraordinary that my rational mind questioned whether it could have really happened exactly as I remembered. But the photographs did not lie, and when I reached the nearest town with internet connection 3 days later, I began the process of sharing them with the world. I sent the images first to National Geographic, where I had published many times before, along with a detailed written account of what I had witnessed. Their response came within hours, disbelief mixed with excitement, requests for additional verification, questions about the sequence of events. They sent the photographs to multiple experts, primatologists, lion behaviorists, anyone who might be able to confirm or explain what the images showed. The consensus was unanimous. The photographs were genuine, unaltered, and depicted behavior that had never been documented before in the wild. Within a week, the story broke internationally, my photographs appearing on front pages, in magazines, on news websites around the globe. The response was overwhelming. Millions of people viewing the images, sharing them, commenting on them, all touched by the same miracle that had touched me on that muddy riverbank. Scientists proposed various theories to explain the gorilla's behavior, some suggesting he might have lost his own offspring and was acting on misdirected parental instinct, others proposing that great apes possess a more developed sense of empathy than previously understood, still others claiming the whole event was simply unusual circumstance, misinterpreted by an emotional observer. But none of them had been there. None of them had looked into that silverback's eyes and seen the clarity of purpose, the conscious decision to act despite risk and difficulty. I defended my interpretation in interviews and articles, not from ego, but from certainty. I knew what I had seen, and no amount of scientific skepticism could diminish the truth of that moment. The story resonated most powerfully not with scientists, but with ordinary people, with parents who saw in the gorilla's rescue a reflection of their own protective instincts, with anyone who had ever helped a stranger without expecting reward, with those who believed the world still held mysteries and magic that transcended cold biological explanations. I received thousands of letters and emails, people sharing their own stories of unexpected compassion, of barriers crossed, of moments when they witnessed something that restored their faith in goodness. Many told me that in times of division and anger, when humans seem determined to focus on their differences and conflicts, this story reminded them that kindness exists at a fundamental level, that compassion is not learned behavior, but something deeper, something that connects all living things. Those responses meant more to me than any award or publication. They confirmed what I had felt instinctively on the riverbank, that this story needed to be told not as a curiosity but as a lesson. Several months after the incident, I received an unexpected email from a research team that had been studying the same region where I had camped. They had identified the gorilla from my photographs, a mature male named by locals as Mountain Shadow, known for his unusual habit of traveling alone rather than with a family group. They told me something that made my skin prickle with goosebumps. 2 years earlier, Mountain Shadow's mate and infant had drowned during a similar flood, swept away while trying to cross a swollen stream. He had survived, but his family had not, and since then he had been observed acting strangely protective around water, once even helping a young gorilla from another group that had fallen into a river. The researchers believed that Mountain Shadow's trauma had created in him a heightened awareness of drowning danger, that his loss had somehow sensitized him to the peril of others in water, regardless of species. This information added another layer of profound sadness and beauty to the story. The gorilla had suffered the worst loss imaginable, and instead of becoming bitter or fearful, he had transformed his grief into purpose, into vigilance, into a determination that what happened to his family would not happen to others if he could prevent it. That is courage of the highest order, not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, motivated by memory and loss, and an unwillingness to let tragedy be the final word. When I learned this, I wept again, sitting alone in my office, surrounded by the awards and publications that had come from that day's photographs, understanding fully now what I had witnessed. Mountain Shadow had not saved that cub on impulse or instinct. He had saved it because he knew in the deepest part of his being, what it meant to lose someone to the water's fury, and he had chosen with full consciousness to prevent another family from experiencing that pain. Before I continue to the final parts of this story, I need to pause again and speak directly to you, whoever you are, wherever you are watching this from. If you have followed this journey with me to this point, if Mountain Shadow's story has touched something in your heart, then I ask you sincerely to subscribe to this channel, to become part of a community that believes these stories matter. But more than that, I want to hear from you. Please leave a comment telling me about a time when you witnessed unexpected compassion, when someone or something crossed boundaries to help another, when you saw evidence that kindness is not just a human trait, but something deeper and more universal. Your stories inspire me. They remind me why I continue this work despite the hardships and challenges. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, someone who has forgotten that goodness still exists in the world, please share this video with them. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind each other that miracles still happen, that courage wears many faces, and that compassion knows no boundaries. Now let me tell you about what happened when I returned to that riverbank, and what I discovered about the ongoing relationship between Mountain Shadow and the lion Pride he had helped. 6 months after the rescue, I returned to the region with proper authorization and support from the research team that had identified Mountain Shadow. I needed to know if there had been any lasting impact from the incident, whether the extraordinary moment I had witnessed was truly an isolated event or part of something larger. The valley looked completely different from how I remembered it. The river had returned to its normal size, a peaceful stream maybe 15 meters wide with clear water running over smooth stones, impossible to reconcile with the violent brown monster I had seen. The muddy banks where everything had happened were now covered with fresh grass and flowering plants, nature erasing the evidence of trauma with new growth, the way it always does. I set up camp in almost the same location, and for the first 3 days I saw nothing unusual, just the normal rhythms of African wildlife, zebras grazing in the distance, giraffes moving through acacia trees with their peculiar grace, birds of every description filling the air with song. On the 4th morning, just after dawn when the light was soft and golden, I saw them. The lion Pride emerged from the tall grass near the river, the same Pride I was certain. I recognized the male immediately with his magnificent dark mane, now perhaps even fuller and more impressive than before. The 4 lionesses moved with him, and among them, now much larger and more confident, were several cubs, including one that caught my attention immediately. This cub, now perhaps 8 months old and already showing signs of the powerful adult it would become, had a distinctive marking on its face, a small scar above its right eye. I trained my telephoto lens on the young lion and felt my breath catch. It was the same cub, I was certain of it, the one Mountain Shadow had pulled from the river. The scar was likely from that day, from the trauma of clinging to the rock or being tossed in the current. The Pride moved to the river to drink, and they did so at the exact spot where the rescue had occurred, and I wondered if they remembered, if some instinct or memory connected this place with what had happened here. I was so focused on the lions that I almost missed the movement in the forest behind me, the familiar sound of heavy passage through thick vegetation. I turned slowly, carefully, not wanting to startle whoever was approaching, and my heart began to pound when I saw the distinctive silver saddle emerging from the green shadows. Mountain Shadow stepped into the clearing about 30 meters from where I sat, and he was even more impressive than I remembered, if that were possible. He moved with the dignified power that only mature silverback gorillas possess, and he walked directly toward the river, toward the exact spot where the lions were drinking. I held my breath, expecting the cats to flee or prepare to defend themselves, but neither happened. Instead, the lionesses looked up, saw the gorilla, and simply moved aside, creating space for him at the water's edge. The male lion, who by all normal rules should have seen the silverback as a threat or competitor, merely watched with what I can only describe as calm acceptance. Mountain Shadow approached the water and knelt to drink, just 3 meters from the nearest lioness, and she did not tense, did not show any sign of concern. They drank together, predator and primate, in a peace that defied natural law. The young cub with the scar, curious as all youngsters are, began to move toward Mountain Shadow, and I felt my chest tighten with anxiety, but the mother simply watched, made no move to stop her offspring. The cub approached to within a meter of the massive gorilla, staring up at him with golden eyes full of innocent curiosity, and Mountain Shadow looked down at the young lion with those deep, intelligent eyes I remembered so well. For perhaps 10 seconds they regarded each other, the gorilla who had saved and the lion who had been saved, and I do not care what scientists might say, there was recognition in that moment. There was memory. Then the cub made a small sound, not aggressive but almost playful, and Mountain Shadow made a soft grunting vocalization in response, and the young lion turned and bounded back to its mother. The silverback finished drinking, sat back on his haunches for a moment watching the Pride, and then stood and walked back toward the forest. As he passed the male lion, the great cat lowered his head slightly, just a small dip of acknowledgement. But it was there, and Mountain Shadow responded with his own subtle gesture, a slow blink, and then he was gone back into the green world that was his domain. I remained sitting there long after both the gorilla and the lions had disappeared, my camera filled with new images that documented an ongoing relationship that should not exist, that violated everything we thought we knew about territorial behavior and species interaction. Over the next 2 weeks, I witnessed similar encounters 3 more times. Mountain Shadow would appear, the lions would make space, they would share the water source in peace, and sometimes the cubs would approach him, and he would tolerate their presence with what seemed like patient amusement. The research team was astounded by my documentation. They had not observed these interactions before, primarily because they had not been looking for them. Why would they? Who would expect a gorilla and a lion pride to have developed some kind of understanding, some mutual respect that transcended normal behavior? But the evidence was undeniable. Something had changed in that moment 6 months ago on a flooded riverbank. Some boundary had been crossed that remained crossed. Mountain Shadow had saved one of their own, and the lions had not forgotten. They had incorporated that knowledge into how they responded to his presence, and he seemed to understand that he was welcome in their territory in a way that no other gorilla would be. This ongoing relationship became the subject of multiple research papers, conferences, and documentaries. Scientists spent years trying to understand the mechanisms behind it, the cognitive processes that allowed both gorillas and lions to override their instinctive behaviors, the memory capacities required to maintain cross-species recognition over time, the social structures that accommodated this unprecedented cooperation. But for me, the explanation remained simple and profound. Mountain Shadow had demonstrated compassion, and the lions had recognized and honored it, and both species proved capable of maintaining that recognition far beyond what we believed possible. That is the real miracle. Not just the rescue itself, but the lasting impact it had, the way it changed relationships and perceptions for everyone involved. Years have passed since that morning when I stood helpless on a muddy riverbank and watched a gorilla risk everything to save a drowning lion cub. The photographs from that day have been published in dozens of languages, viewed by millions of people around the world, used in classrooms to teach about animal behavior, and in churches to illustrate sermons about compassion and sacrifice. I have given hundreds of interviews, written articles, and eventually a book about the experience, and with each retelling, the story has reached new audiences and inspired new conversations about consciousness, morality, and the artificial boundaries we draw between human and animal minds. But success and recognition were never the point. The point was always about what that moment taught me, taught all of us who were willing to listen. Mountain Shadow taught me that grief can be transformed into purpose, that loss does not have to lead to bitterness, but can instead create heightened compassion for others who suffer. He taught me that courage is not the absence of risk, but the willingness to accept risk for something more important than personal safety. He taught me that intelligence and consciousness exist in forms we are only beginning to understand, that the great apes are not diminished versions of humans, but complete beings with their own rich inner lives, their own moral frameworks, their own capacity for heroism. The lions taught me that gratitude transcends language, that recognition of nobility can cross any divide, that even apex predators understand when they have witnessed something worthy of respect. And the ongoing relationship between Mountain Shadow and the pride taught me that these were not isolated responses, but part of something deeper, a capacity for sustained cooperation and memory that we are only beginning to document in the wild. Most importantly, this experience taught me humility. Humility about how much we still do not understand about the natural world, about consciousness, about the emotional and moral lives of animals we have too long dismissed as operating purely on instinct. I return to that valley every year for the next decade, documenting the continued peaceful interactions between Mountain Shadow and the lion pride, watching the rescued cub grow into a powerful adult female who eventually had cubs of her own, cubs who grew up accepting the presence of a silverback gorilla as normal, as safe, as part of their world. Mountain Shadow aged as all living things do, his silver saddle spreading wider across his back, his movements becoming gradually slower and more deliberate, but he never stopped his vigilant watches over the river, never stopped his protective presence. The research team estimated he saved at least 3 more young animals from water-related dangers during those years, including a young buffalo calf and 2 more lion cubs from the same pride, though none of these rescues were as dramatic or dangerous as the first. He had appointed himself guardian of that stretch of river, and he maintained that role until the very end. I received the message on a Tuesday morning, a brief email from the research team. Mountain Shadow had been found that morning near his usual sleeping site in the forest, passed peacefully in his sleep, his body showing no signs of trauma or illness, just the natural conclusion of a long and extraordinary life. He was estimated to be approximately 35 years old, ancient for a wild gorilla, and he had lived his final years with a purpose that many humans never find. I traveled back one final time for what the research team had organized as a memorial observation, dozens of researchers and conservationists gathering to honor the life of a remarkable being. We stood near the river on a morning very much like the one when I had first witnessed his courage, and we shared stories and observations, each person contributing pieces to the fuller picture of who Mountain Shadow had been. What moved me most was that the lions came. As we stood there in our circle of remembrance, the pride emerged from the grass, led now by the female who had been that tiny cub clinging to a rock so many years before. They did not approach closely, maintaining a respectful distance, but they sat there for nearly an hour, the entire pride, just sitting and looking toward the forest where Mountain Shadow had lived. Whether they understood death, whether they were paying respects in any way we could recognize, I cannot say with scientific certainty, but I know what I felt in that moment. I felt that they knew, they understood that something important had ended, that the guardian was gone and they had come to acknowledge it. That image, the lion pride sitting vigil while humans gathered to honor a gorilla, became the final photograph in my book, the closing image that brought the entire story full circle. It showed better than any words could that what happened on that flooded riverbank years ago was not an anomaly or a misunderstanding, but the beginning of something profound, a glimpse into possibilities. We are only beginning to explore about the depth of animal consciousness and the capacity for cross-species relationships built on mutual respect rather than dominance or fear. Mountain Shadow's legacy extends far beyond the individuals he saved. His story has influenced conservation efforts, inspired new research into great ape cognition, and most importantly, touched millions of hearts and changed how people think about animals and our relationship with the natural world. If one gorilla could display such courage and compassion, what other remarkable capabilities exist in the animals we share this planet with? What other depths of emotion and intelligence are we missing because we have not looked carefully enough, because we have been too quick to dismiss as instinct what might actually be conscious choice, moral reasoning, even love in forms we do not yet fully comprehend? I'm an old man now, my hands too unsteady for the precise work of wildlife photography, my body too worn for the hardships of camping in remote locations, but I carry Mountain Shadow with me every day. When the world feels dark and human cruelty dominates the news, I think of a gorilla who lost everything, yet chose to save another family from experiencing that same loss. I think of lions who set aside ancient instincts to honor courage when they saw it. I think of barriers crossed and compassion flowing where logic said it should not exist. That is what gives me hope. Not naive optimism, but evidence-based certainty that kindness is fundamental, that courage exists in many forms, and that the divides we think are permanent can be crossed by anyone willing to take the risk. Mountain Shadow proved that the measure of greatness is not strength or power, but the willingness to risk everything for another, even when that other is not your species, not your family, not your responsibility. It is a lesson that humanity needs desperately, especially now. And it came from a gorilla who could not speak our language but taught us anyway, through action rather than words, through courage rather than rhetoric. This story I have shared with you is not just about one remarkable day and one heroic act. It is about transformation, about how witnessing something extraordinary changes you forever, about how one moment of pure compassion can ripple outward through time and space, touching countless lives. It changed me from a photographer trying to capture nature's beauty into a storyteller trying to share nature's wisdom. It changed scientific understanding of what gorillas and lions are capable of, and I hope it has changed you somehow, made you look at the world with slightly different eyes, made you believe that miracles still exist not in supernatural intervention, but in the choices that living beings make when faced with suffering and have the power to act. I hope you will carry Mountain Shadow's legacy forward by remembering that compassion transcends boundaries, that courage wears many faces, and that every act of kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey, for listening to an old man share the most important story of his life, and for being the kind of person who cares enough to watch a video about a gorilla and a lion and the moment when everything changed. That caring, that willingness to be moved by another's courage, is what will save us all in the end.